I had the opportunity to speak with Emma Krebs via an introduction through a friend. Thanks, Joy. Emma is a freelance expert in producing content in the creator economy, including podcasts and YouTube videos. And she is curious and open to learning not just from what comes her way, but what she goes after. Originally inspired by the concept of minimalism, she's been traveling the world gaining insight into human nature, connection, and relationships ever since. And when she talks about the why in relation to podcasting, for example, think about what that might mean for you. If there's a project you want to start or are already working on, what's your why? And is it even important for you to define your why? Here's my conversation with Emma.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you. And I don't want to bring the karma in, but I do want to acknowledge your generosity in doing a take 2 since I forgot to record the first one. So thank you.
It's from all the times that I've done the same, so do not even worry. I understand.
I appreciate that. And the good thing is I'm of a certain age that we can have pretty much the same conversation again. It's going to feel fresh to me.
Same. I was going to look back at our email thread and then I was like, maybe there will be beauty in resparking things, and hopefully I'll say something even better this time.
Well, it was pretty awesome the first time, so I have no doubt. I really was looking forward to speaking to you again. And I thought I'd start by just asking you to talk a little bit about the path that brought you to podcasting.
Mm-hmm. So I discovered my first podcast, I think it was in 2017. I found it after watching a documentary called Minimalism. And somehow I'd found out that they had a podcast and I wanted to learn more about what they were doing. So I discovered the Minimalist podcast and I thought it was super cool. I loved the medium and I loved that you could be like this voyeur or a fly on the wall to these conversations. And the reason it added to such significant value to my life at that time was it was providing like perspectives I didn't have exposure to in my daily life. I was about 19 at that time. And so it was also very informative years, I feel. And so it was really cool to hear these, at that time to me, like alternative conversations and learn new things. So yeah, I loved that medium. And I just was always trying to find more similar podcasts or podcasts that just really helped to broaden my perspective. And then at that point, I started traveling and just like going out into the world. Again, I kept coming back to a lot of things I would hear on a podcast. And it really was like helping me digest things and open my mind to try new experiences as well. And so from there, I was just consuming the medium. And then in 2019, I remember I was sitting with my partner. I always knew that I wanted to like do something more. I always just had just like conventional jobs. And I was like, I want to do something like creative. I want to do something different. And he's like, well, you love podcasts. So why don't you like start a podcast? And at that time, I knew nothing about how to make one. I never went to school for media or had any sort of like training in that regard. And so I bought my first microphone, which is the one I'm using now. And I remember I couldn't even listen to my own voice. I would record something and just be so thrown off. But long story short, after a few more months and traveling and just kind of feeling really lost in that chapter of my life, I decided that it was finally time to bite the bullet and to start my own podcast, which at that time seemed like crazy. So my only goal was to get a show on Apple Podcasts. I had no idea how I was going to do that. So I was like, okay, you eat an elephant one bite at a time. And I just like slowly worked backwards. And I have an amazing friend. His name is Juan Carrillo. He's an entrepreneur and I knew he had an amazing story. He is also one of my like closest friends. And so I was like, this is perfect. Low barrier to entry. I'll chat with him because if it doesn't work, like I can just scrap it and that's fine because he's my friend. So I ended up recording that podcast, which then led to me recording like over 80 podcasts. And I just loved it. I loved the conversations I could have, the whole experience from start to finish. That was more of a hobby. And then as my career kind of started, again, I had just kind of odd jobs, but I always knew I wanted to do something in the creative industry. So I had gotten a job in social media marketing, and that was great. It was so crazy to me that I was getting paid to like scroll on Instagram all day. From there, I had been making my show for almost 2 years at that time, I think. And I was listening to the Minimalist podcast, and they had mentioned that they had an internship coming up. And I remember that's all they said. And I got like full body chills. I just really feel like my intuition was really guiding me in that moment because, like I said, I had absolutely no foundation of knowledge on the role. And yet I always felt like they were speaking directly to me and like they were looking for me without sounding too weird. And so I did apply for the internship. Like I remember the first time I recorded my video, I was like crying a little bit and not in like an emotional way, but just because I felt so like aligned. And obviously I did not submit that one. And I went through the interview process and myself and two other interns got the job. So I was the only Canadian that got hired because they are based in Beverly Hills in Los Angeles. And so I was given 2 weeks to quit my job, get rid of my apartment, and said bye to my boyfriend was living in Canada at the time with me. And I moved to LA. And that experience was so pivotal for me. Not only was it literally my first paid job in podcasting, but it took it from a hobby to being like, okay, this is a genuine industry. It is the creator economy. Like, this is a business opportunity, which don't get me wrong, it clearly started with the hobby and the interest and the passion. But if I wanted to sustain my rent and my lifestyle, I needed money. And so that experience showed me what a high level show does. And it also showed me all the 10 other people in the room on these bigger shows, which I didn't realize existed until I was there in person. Meaning I thought just the hosts were the only ones who were creating these shows, which is common for indie shows. But for these larger ones, that was it. So from there, I've moved multiple times. I'm currently in the UK, and I've really just made it my mission to learn as much as I can about the industry and knock on every door and talk to any person I can. Relationships have been massive for me just to gain as much experience and exposure in the industry as possible. So that's kind of led me to where I am now. Sorry if I took that on a bit of a tangent, but that's just what came up.
No, that's perfect. I did want to ask a question about your first show, your hobby show.
Mm-hmm.
Because as Chris, when you said you invited your best friend, I also started with somebody I knew really well, because this is a safe space, right?
Yep.
But did you start with some idea of what the theme of your show was going to be?
I knew it was going to be an interview style show, and I am an innately curious person. So I knew it was going to be me on the mic, and it wasn't going to be fiction or like a narrative piece. I also felt like at that time, I don't know how old I was in my early 20s. I was like, I don't have much to say. So I wanted to use the platform to leverage other people's story. And so I think it kind of guided itself from there. The show was called The Curious One. And I feel like it's like that will always hold true to my soul and like mean so much to me. Sometimes I check in on there every once in a while. And then I think once I got to like the third episode was the first person I recorded with that was a complete stranger until like we met to record. And then again, that was a revolutionary moment of, oh, okay, I've met a complete stranger. Like, who else could I meet? And it ended up being global. As you would know, it's crazy how these micro steps just lead you on this path.
That's cool. It did, because I question myself about that sometimes, because I started with a certain idea about what the conversations would be like. And then I find myself casting a very wide net. I was just like, oh, this person is really interesting. Can I somehow sort of shoehorn them into the theme, what I think is the theme? But maybe what I think is the theme isn't even the theme. And I think you were following your passion. And maybe if we follow passion, the theme, maybe looking back, you might see some threads that run through the conversations and maybe not. And does that even really matter?
I think it comes down to why an individual's making the show, right? And obviously, like, I don't mean to keep talking about money, but it is what runs our world, right? And a lot of people, I think, enter podcasting thinking they're going to make money, which, to be completely frank, is not often the case, especially for 99% of podcasters. There's so many shows, but that doesn't mean that it is not a reason to enter, right? And so I think my point of you talking about, like, did you know what you wanted to make? Obviously, we want to make a sustainable show if this is something you want to do for the long term. But if you're really just doing it out of your own passion, like, yeah, let it run. Like, have it be a creative expression. You never judge any sort of creative thing. But if it's like a corporation coming to me wanting to make a 6-part series, it's a different story, right? So I think it's really getting clear on your why, which I think is so important in podcasting.
Okay, interesting. So how would you say you are different in being a podcast host? So when you started your own show and you were following your why versus your roles now as producer?
Mhm.
How is that
Yes.
different for you in your self-expression?
Ooh. Should I also shed light about what I do now? I feel like I
That's a
didn't.
good question.
Okay,
Yeah, I like that
okay.
question.
It changes all the time, I'll be completely frank. And that's due to just me. I think I just love moving forward. Anyways, so at the moment, I am a freelance producer and I work exclusively in the creator economy. I work with content creators and I work with the ones that live more on YouTube. And so my role now is fully behind the scenes. And I think for the longest time, I thought to work in podcasting, you had to be on the mic. And that was part of why I started my own show, but also like it was a great experience and I really loved it. And so in regards to creative expression, I feel like, to be honest, the creativity piece is a lot less than when I was on the mic because that was fully my own show. I had really no constraints because I was trying new things, different colors, different fonts. I wouldn't really say I explored much with format, but right now I have constraints of like, okay, this is the creator. I often have their themes, their voice, their values in my mind as I go forward. I have the constraints of the brand guidelines, the fonts, the colors, etc. But in the bigger picture, I actually feel like I have bigger creativity around my life, if this makes sense. I'm often pitching the shows and I'm often telling the clients like what I can offer them. And so I actually kind of get creative in that and like building my life, I think, and maybe the skills that I want to retain as I go forward. Did that answer the question?
Yeah. No,
Okay.
that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Because I'm curious, so as a freelancer, who are the creators or what are the topics that attract you most to working with?
So I have a few parameters I look for. The majority of the shows that I work on or projects I work on, I have pitched the creator. And I think that's really important because there is just something innate within me that has drawn me to that person. And oftentimes, the majority of people, I was already consuming their content. So I resonated with them for a reason. And so the number one thing is who they are as a person, their energy, how I feel about it when I consume their content. And then I also like for them to have a deeper message. I realize now we're getting in a world where there's so much and short form is also so massive. And I just, as a person, I need some more depth. So often, if I can see that they have kind of themes they've touched on before, that I'm like, oh, we could talk about this in an hour and a half long episode. And then it also does help if I work with people that are YouTube creators because they are already posting long form content, so they can do that. I've noticed with some people that make shorter form content, they're not able to do that. I just make sure that they understand that this is a long-term thing. I get clear on their why. Obviously, money is a conversation, but I don't want it to be like the main driver for them. It's a very personal job. I feel like there's a lot of trust between myself and the clients. And so I also just really have to get along with them personally too.
When you said earlier about when you went to the minimalist show and you realized that there's 10 people in the room, what struck me in that moment, and now I'm just trying to think about you and your role now, I think of the creator economy as like being super digital, right? Are you actually in the same room with these people physically, or do you work from a distance with them?
At the moment, I'm fully remote, but yeah, like when I was working on the minimalist, that was part of the job was I needed to live in LA. I do like to travel to meet my clients. I've never met them in real life, so like Eamon and Beck, I just went to Toronto a couple months ago, and I hung out with them in person, and we shot a podcast. I just think with my life at the minute, I like to be remote. But that's good and bad at, which I can unpack in a different conversation if you want.
I can relate to that because I'm 25 years in my career and I would say 20 of them were remote. So
Right.
I've spent most of my life interacting with people through a screen
Mhm.
anyway. And so there's pluses and minuses to that. It certainly gives you a lot of independence.
Yes. But it's honestly been a struggle. I also like to shed light on I live in a town of 20,000 people and I've really struggled to make friends. And so, although it's provided such opportunity, I'm imagining for yourself as well that literally I can speak with anyone. But yeah, I've learned through this experience how much in person connection is so vital to myself, though.
I remember thinking I wasn't going to be able to do my job properly unless I met those people face to face at least once.
Ooh.
And now I don't have that opportunity anymore because people are
Okay.
global. And so I think it maybe takes a little bit longer, and you need to have
Yep.
more of those conversations to be able to feel like you've got enough of a relationship to work well together. But maybe it just takes more time.
I completely agree. I think that's something I learned quickly. And I don't know if it was like, because I love to travel. At first, I was like, am I just using this as an excuse? So when I would say, I'm going to book a flight to meet my client, and I was not factoring that in cost wise. So I'm paying out of pocket. I'm a freelancer here. And I would be making these trips to meet the clients. But truly, at the end of the day, I think it's completely worth it. Because I've made the mistake of working with people and never meeting them, never even hopping on a phone call. And then you get into working with them and you just have so many breakdowns of communication, or I'm very much an energy person. And so I've had that experience with an accountant, and I'm like, oh my God, next time I'm going to call them or go to their office. So yeah.
You do a little
Yeah.
like eye to
Yeah.
eye,
Once
kind of like
over.
read that person a little bit. I hear you. I hear you.
Completely. Yeah.
One of the questions that I had sent you was related to something that I'd read that you'd written. And I'm thinking about this also just in terms of your why, for example, that you said, connection is the fuel for my life. And I think that relates to some of what we're talking about. But can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yes. I don't even know where to start, but I just think it's so true. And I think for the past little while here, like the past few months, like full transparency, I think I've been denying myself that and denying how essential that is for the fuel of my life. Personally, I think that's why we're here, is to build connections with one another, to be seen by one another, to hold space for one another. And I just feel like I've done the most growth, the most healing, and like found the most love within my relationships in whatever capacity that could be. I really feel that way really deeply, for sure.
And you feel like, well, we've touched on this a bit already now, but you can get that at a distance as well as in person. If you don't have a lot of opportunity right now where you live to connect with people face to face, you can get that through your interactions with others. I mean, just like Zoom makes such a huge difference to be able to see you, like your energy is completely blowing through the screen. Like, I got it. I feel it. Like, so that must be good for you for connecting with people as you work remotely.
It is. And don't get me wrong, I feel so lucky that like living abroad, I can FaceTime my mom and see her face and everything like that. My sister just had a baby. I get to like see photos of the baby. What a blessing. But I do feel like this rectangular box that provides me the money to pay my rent, I spend so much time with it. And sometimes we have a hot and cold relationship where I just need a break from it. And I just think with how isolated I have been the past couple of years, I really appreciate the in person connections, because one of the challenges I come up against with these digital things, if we're talking like personal relationships, is say I do want to spend time with someone, you have to be talking all the time. And that can be challenging sometimes when the last thing you want to do is talk, or maybe you're going through something challenging, or someone else is going through something challenging. And you don't want to ask them, how are you doing? Because you know they're not doing well. And you don't want to have to chat about that. But what? Do we just sit on the call and stare at each other? I think that technology and like social media, it can be controversial. And I see the pros and the cons. I think it's just like, this is where we're headed. And so I don't know. I often really question it. And I also question, like, should I just get a job that's in person and be on a salary and let go of all of this sometimes? The other thing I'll add there is I've been living here for like 2.5 years, and I just took a trip back to Canada and the US, and I was there for about 2 months. And I did find it quite difficult to assimilate back into community and to have in-person interactions. They were honestly a little bit overwhelming, a little bit embarrassing to say, but yeah, I really struggled to like make eye contact with people. I would often get really flustered, but it was just really overwhelming because I had such a lack of true like deep social interaction. Like I've had a lot of surface level conversations. I still obviously go to the shops and the cafes, but to have your friend sit across from you and look you in the eye and really ask how you're doing, at least for me, like I can't really have these more vulnerable conversations digitally. Like I need that in-person time and to feel someone's energy before I can begin to like really uncover how I deeply feel, if I'm honest.
So I do find it interesting that it's not just the fact that you work remotely, but you actually work in podcasting. and with people who are YouTube creators. And that's not in person. That is exactly, in some sense, passive consumption of content without that kind of interactivity. So it's interesting that you were drawn to those media to work in that field, but maybe the other parts, you need to supplement that in the rest of your life with that in-person human connection.
Mm-hmm. I think to add to that is I think why I've been so drawn to it is growing up, I didn't have any friendship. Like I didn't have many friends. I had two friends. One was always busy. She became a professional ballerina, so she was always in the studio. And then my cousin was my only other friend, and she lived in a different province. I grew up in Canada, so she lived like hours away. And so I honestly spent a lot of time alone. I went to a really small school. And so I found myself logging online to seek out this connection. And as much as I have said it is challenging digitally, but that being said, if you feel like this quote unquote like weirdo, or you feel a lot different than the people around you in your physical environment, you can go online and find people that maybe have similar interests to you, similar perspectives, to really help you find that community if your in-person area is not providing that for you. You have access to so much information digitally that it's like it can really open up your mind as well too. So I think for me, that's why I've been so drawn to podcasting and YouTube, is because even once I grew up and I started to find my friends, I've been traveling and living abroad for a while. And although you meet people, you do find you spend a lot of time alone, I feel like, in these transitions and in these periods. And so again, I'm often logging online to seek out that connection again there too.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, like you said, it's the world we live in now, too. So it's on us to gain comfort and competence in a digital world while also pursuing what we need, the things that we can't get in that way through actual interactions with others face to face, or the best friend looking across the room at you, especially when things are not good. And you don't have to say anything. You just pick up your cup of tea, and
Yeah.
it doesn't work so well when you're on the phone.
No.
So just what you were saying now leads me to ask you, what does vulnerability mean to you?
To me, when I think of the word vulnerability, the other word that always comes up for me is courage. I think being vulnerable takes so much courage that I think sometimes we struggle to have, at least for myself. I really struggle to have the courage sometimes. I view vulnerability as a vulnerable experience, right? And so to put yourself out there and to show yourself, yeah, it takes a lot of courage. My experience with it has been interesting. It's been easier some chapters of life than it has in others. A pivotal time for me was before I moved to England. I was living in Canada for a little bit. So this was between the LA chapter and between where I live now. And I joined a women's circle, and that was so powerful. It was in person, but I think it really challenged my experience and my definition of vulnerability, and almost like opened up the parameters of the possibilities of how vulnerable a person can be, and sharing the ugly stuff and the dark stuff that you're ashamed of, you're guilty about. And I think that experience has stayed with me and almost set like a marker, I think, as I begin to create new relationships like in my personal life. But yeah, the word I think of is courage. And I just feel like that is how it feels in my body when I have the courage to be vulnerable. Yeah.
I mean, I think you showed it from the minute you put out your first podcast episode of your own, because you were young. And even if you say, I wasn't really revealing much about myself, it was really just asking questions of the other people, you put out over 80 episodes. And I'm sure anybody who would go back and listen to the 80 would learn a lot about you just from questions that you asked, the people that you were attracted to talking to. You end up revealing a lot about yourself. And so you showed that courage, I think, just like from the get-go. And I'm so impressed, because I was a lot older and I was terrified. So it's like, man, I can't believe you did that. It was incredible.
Thank you. As you know, it's a very vulnerable thing, even just like reaching out, even before you press publish, to be like, hi, this stranger that I don't know, like, you're opening yourself to be rejected, of like, no, I can't meet with you or whatever. Obviously, personally, I feel like a email rejection is the easiest rejection in the world, but I've learned that for some people, they get really in their head about it. But start to finish, it can be very vulnerable, but it's a muscle sometimes. Do you feel that way? I feel like when I'm vulnerable with people that feel safe, I feel a lot more able to be vulnerable and authentic in experiences that I might not feel as confident. Confident might not be the right word, but as courageous, I guess.
It's easier to take risks now, or what actually don't feel like risks anymore. So I'm really used to people not answering me.
Yeah.
And
same.
before that I used to feel like, oh, that hurt my feelings. But now
Yeah.
I send the emails, or I reach out to people who don't know me, and I kind of think, quite right on you. I mean, you don't know me, so
Yeah.
it's not personal. And it's something, if you don't respond to me, it's not for you.
Exactly.
And so it's
I was
okay.
going to say that. Yeah.
Okay.
I completely agree. It'll hit the right people. And I've also lately, I've really had the mantra of what's meant for you will not pass you. Like I've just really had that in my head lately too. So yeah, I love that.
I don't know, this is me going off on a tangent now, but there's something about where you started exploring through the minimalist philosophy, sort of pulling that forward through your life. I think you can probably see how you've used or applied that approach. I'm trying to think of, I don't know why I'm going off on a weird tangent around minimalism and vulnerability. Like there's something about stripping away. It just is like, I'm going to let go of all the stuff that doesn't matter. And I'm not so vulnerable in that moment because I'm just me now.
Ooh, I could see the parallel there 1,000,000%. I think of something that I think it was Josh, like from the Minimalist, always said is like living a simple life is not is not easy, and I think that is the case. I think the more that we're stripping back and removing these distractions, these things, the physical clutter, the digital clutter, it really forces you to look at the internal clutter, and it can be really jarring. And yeah, I can completely see the parallel there. And also, when you do strip back all of these parts of yourself, like you are just left alone. It's really, like you said, just you. You saying that made me think the first time I ever like lived abroad, I was living in Australia. And when I first went there, obviously the only podcast at that time I listened to was The Minimalist. I was very on my minimalism journey. And for the first 9 months, I think I lived out of just a carry-on bag. And that's what I had. All of my items, clothes, computer, everything. And up until that point, I had been very into clothing and my physical appearance. So I would have been like 19 at that time. I worked at a store called Aritzia. So I had a crazy closet. And then I was working for Canadians, I worked at Earl's. So there was a dress code. And if you weren't feeling good that day, you were told to put on extra makeup and suck it up. It was very much about that. And I found I put a lot of my value in my physical appearance. So then to be in a hostel in Australia, being stripped back, I didn't have my hair curler. I didn't have these clothes. I literally, at that time, only wore black Lululemon clothes, leggings and a t-shirt. That was literally all I wore. I felt very vulnerable at that time. And it sounds kind of dumb saying it now, but I think, especially for like people my age or younger, it is a thing. I started to see the value that I had to offer the world beyond how I looked. And it was like a really empowering experience to have everything stripped away from me.
There are several ways to learn more about Emma and what she's up to. You can check out her website, emmakrebs.com, her Instagram at @ByEmmaKrebs, and her YouTube channel also at @ByEmmaKrebs. And I highly recommend her podcast, The Curious One, for over 80 captivating conversations.